Welcome. We're here once again this year at LaSalle to take a look at current statuses, trends, and so on in the autism community. We're very lucky to have with us today one of the pioneers, one of the mavericks really of the entire autism community. There was a time when autism was not a common household word, where the current statistics of 1 in approximately 50 children diagnosed in the spectrum was not a reality. There was a time when those figures were closer to 1 or 2 in 10,000 people, and sometimes even less than that, where autism was a very isolating condition that families faced, sometimes in isolation. That was a time when Temple Grandin was diagnosed, the early 1950s. For those not familiar with Temple Grandin, Temple was born with some developmental challenges. She grew up in a perspective where autism was not really recognized, was not really looked at as in some ways a viable way of living as it is today. She was met with challenges every step of the way. She was lucky enough to have an amazing mother, a mother who really all mothers aspire to be. Her name is Eustacia Cutler. We're lucky enough to have with us today Eustacia Cutler to speak with us about her trials and tribulations, her successes, challenges, her ongoing struggle to advocate for individuals on the spectrum, to bring families hope, to bring all of us some kind of awareness about what it is to be on the spectrum and what it is that our society needs to do to further the understanding, the awareness, the appreciation of what autism truly is. Her book is A Thorn in My Pocket. She's here with us today to discuss not only her recountings from the book, but also what's been happening since writing the book. We're here with, of course, my esteemed co-host, Dr. Carole Patrylo, and we're hoping that this gives you an insight, a little bit of an insight of what that process from a historical perspective and a current day perspective has to offer us. A couple of years ago, Eustacia was involved in consulting with a movie filmed by HBO called Temple Grandin. The wonderful actress portraying her in that movie was, of course, the lovely Julie Ormond. And amazing account of their struggles, their growing together as a mother and a daughter. Julie, of course, won the award for the Best Supporting Actress. And if my understanding is correct, Eustacia and Julie were at a conference together a couple of years back. Yes. And of course, Julie, being the gracious woman that she is, acknowledged that Eustacia gave up her own dreams, perhaps of becoming an actress someday, to take on the most important role of any woman's life, any person's life, which is to be the parent, to be the mother of a child on the spectrum. And she said, because of her sacrifice, because of the inspiration that Eustacia provided for her, she wanted Eustacia to have the Emmy Award. So we're here today with Eustacia Cutler, the holder of the Emmy,
yes.
Author of A Thorn in My Pocket. Welcome today.
Thank you, thank you. And yes, I thought it was extraordinary for Julia to give me her Emmy.
Yes.
And I think I have to fill you in on the story of the title and how it affected Julia, where it came from.
Yes,
the
please.
Thorn in My Pocket is not Temple.
Yes.
The Thorn in My Pocket is identity. And it came out of the fact that I went back to college when I was 35, which was 18 years later. And Theodore Morrison took me into his creative writing course, which was a great honor. And I told him I was anxious because I had been away from college for so long. Now, Theodore Morrison was a great friend of Robert Frost. And he said Frost went to lecturing late in life. And he admitted to Mr. Morrison that it made him very nervous. And he said he always carried something in his pocket that he could touch when he was talking, so he would remember who he was. That thorn is identity. And Julia took that very seriously. She said, every scene that I played in the movie, I always carried a thorn in my pocket.
Is that right?
So I would remember who I was. Wow. The reason I think it's important is this is what breaks down in families. And yes, you're right, I'm working to guide and support all members of the family where there's autism. And what I see happens is, first of all, a disorientation of identity. If you have a baby who doesn't know who you are, who are you? As I've said many times, a baby needs a mother to know she's a baby, but a mother needs a baby to know she's a mother.
Yes.
It's a two-way street.
Yes.
And when that two-way street doesn't work, we are thrown off as parents. We don't know who we are, and the immediate reaction is, I must be a bad parent, and I must be a bad person. So that, I find, lies at the heart of problems that happen in families, is that loss of identity. And
well, of course, in you, in the 1950s, the message
well,
at that
you see, it was
time
even
very
earlier
different.
than that. Temple was born in 1947, and it was 1949 when I took her to Children's Hospital in Boston.
Yes.
And they were wonderful there. They did not recommend an institution. They recommended speech therapy. Temple couldn't speak. She went to Mrs. Reynolds for 3 years, 3 times a week for 3 hours each session. And Mrs. Reynolds took hold of her jaw, showed her where to put her tongue, the difference between a B and a P. Temple allowed her to touch her. This was a child who didn't want to be touched. It was one of the problems. I think the answer was quite simple. She did want to talk. And Mrs. Reynolds taught her to talk. It took 3 years, but as we all know, Temple hasn't stopped talking ever since.
And thank goodness.
I think what's very true of New England, you see, the Freudian approach was that it was a psychosocial disorder.
Right.
But New Englanders are Puritans. We don't lie down on couches and tell people our troubles. We stand up and face them. They're not going to go, or they didn't then, go with the Freudian idea of psychosocial, which really came out of the behavior pattern. They were really looking at the symptoms. They were not looking at the causes. And I think that Temple's doctor understood that, because he also gave Temple a test for epilepsy. Now, she had these little quiet periods with her head drooping, and he said, let's make sure this isn't petit mal. It wasn't. But it was only 15 years later that it came out, the connection between autism and epilepsy was the first realization that autism was bioneurological and not psychosocial. So that put Boston's Children's Hospital way ahead, and for which I have always been grateful.
Absolutely. Well, I think, and I know Carole is very interested here as well, where you came from at Boston Children's through present day, it's been an entire evolution of really, and a development of a culture. When we
well, you see, there
really
was no autism culture. Yes, there was 1 in 1,000, and Temple was diagnosed in 1949 when she was 2. The culture, though, in many ways was much more family-oriented than it is now. Today, we have a culture that's complicated and shallow and immediate. Everybody can now Google and get answers instantly. They don't even have to know how to spell anymore.
Google will spell it for them.
So there's a certain passivity, a certain expectancy of answers.
Yeah.
There aren't going to be answers. Every child on the spectrum is different. As we've all said, you know one autistic child, you know one autistic child. And I think what I admire very much here, the work you're doing at Green Tree, is that you recognize that, so that it becomes a true partnership with the family and the child.
Yes.
You bringing your expertise, parents their concern, a partnership of concern and expertise. And in that I'm very admiring. I think you're on very much on the right track.
Well, thank you.
And our relationship with Green Tree has been for years and years, as you know, Dr. Mitchell. And we saw it, I guess approximately 3-4 years ago, Eustacia. We've shared this conversation.
Yes.
Here at LaSalle, we have what is known as LADDER, LaSalle Autism Developmental Disabilities Education Resource. And it's family-oriented. Families want to talk to each other. Families want some respite, okay? Children maybe just want to be with other children. And so at our center, which is on West Campus, maybe sometimes the parents want to share something, okay? And so we have marriage family therapy available to them. And we take care of the children, and they're just fine. Talking about the world of technology. Well, some families, they don't even know how to navigate the system.
No, they don't.
They don't
This is a
at
big
all.
problem. At
And
least I did know how to, I knew how to talk to doctors.
Yes.
And I knew how to talk to teachers. And as a result, they could respond. And we could form a partnership. I see a lot of families where that's not true.
No, and you mentioned isolation.
They feel very isolated.
And there's some that they don't even leave their house, you know, or take the child to the grocery store and so forth.
Well, there's a certain humiliation in that.
Yes.
Their child may have a meltdown, and then people will look at them and tell them they're bad parents.
No.
This is...
No.
But
it's not bad parenting.
No, I know it isn't, but the parent has to suffer that. And then, of course, what happens is even the mainstream who've accused her of being a bad parent, they too are thrown off in their identity. You see, where you have a child who doesn't have the neurology that we have to talk to each other as we're talking right now, that whole communication breaks down.
Too much stimuli out there for them. And so I guess we're working on strategies, even at home, how to deal with a child. And maybe you want to share what you did with Temple.
So
you started with a speech language pathologist, right?
Yes.
And that was a lot per week going, 3 hours?
That was a lot. Yeah,
Wow.
that's why I tell it, 3 hours, 3 times a week. 9 hours a week.
And I remember.
Now, the other thing that Mrs. Reynolds did, which I think is very important, yes, speech is important, but that's not all of the picture. It's helping these children to understand that other people have a mind. They don't get the idea that you and I have different minds from each other.
Theory of mind.
Now, the first step that Mrs. Reynolds gave was Temple had to learn to sit in her little chair. There were other children there. And wait her turn. She had to become aware of other children. And I see in first classes, for maybe you do this here, they will have to hold hands with each other. Do you do that?
We do
and
that.
everybody has to raise their hand together?
Yes.
Now, you can't do that unless you're cooperating with
right.
the 2 people on each side of you.
And try to make eye contact.
And make eye contact.
It's a whole
And
social
speaking of
experiment.
eye contact, I loved the teacher who made them draw each other. She gave them sheets of drawing paper. There was a pink sheet and a yellow sheet and a brown sheet. And she'd say, okay, now what color is your friend's face? You pick out which one it is. Then once they picked it out, okay, what color are their eyes? She gave them a blue crayon, a brown crayon, a green crayon. So in this process, they made the pictures, then they hung the pictures up. They were very proud of their pictures. In the process, they had looked at each other for the first time.
The whole social learning
The social
dynamic.
exchange.
And now, years later, of course, we're putting names on the things that you experienced firsthand, the things that were really developing at that time.
Yes,
you mentioned portions of visual strategies. You mentioned social skill development.
That's
You basically mentioned applied
Yes.
behavior analysis and discrete trial training, all there
All
for
in- it was
Temple
all there.
before anybody was writing about this.
That's right. It was all there. And then there was a network for which I am so grateful. When Temple did learn to speak, she was nearly 5. She finally accomplished speech. And Mrs. Reynolds suggested a little summer camp run by Mrs. Huckle, a wonderful British woman who took Temple into her camp and said, I loved her, she looked like the old British movie actress Margaret Rutherford. She wore a huge black velvet tam and she had flowing black velvet pajamas. And she said, Temple, you may come to my camp, but before this summer is over, you must have learned 2 things. You must learn to say the Lord's Prayer, and you must learn always to do your very, very best. Now, what Mrs. Huckle did was really interesting. First of all, she gave Temple an immediate assignment for her learning to speak, which was, and the Lord's Prayer was as good a thing as any to start with. And I've always liked the fact that the Lord's Prayer only asks for today's bread. Not what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next year, just today's bread. And forgive us for what we've done wrong to other people, just so long as we forgive those we think have done a wrong thing to us. 2 very good rules.
Within
And
that
Temple,
prayer.
yes, are in that prayer. So it was a very good first lesson you would have to learn. And then she gave Temple a life lesson. Always do your very best. And Temple always has. Always. And Temple went from
like that
Mrs. Huckle.
story.
It's beautiful.
Again, these connections. Mrs. Huckle said, if you've got a little country day school and they understood Temple's history, I think she could go into kindergarten. She will be 5. Temple was mainstreamed at 5 into the Dedham Country Day School. And I sat down, and again, you see, we were able to talk to each other, and this is important. And the headmaster of the school said, yes, we will take Temple. We're educators. It's what we think we should be doing. And then his name was Mr. Everett Ladd. Mr. Ladd turned the problem over to Mrs. Deach, who was in charge of nursery school through 3rd grade. And Mrs. Deach and I decided that we would always talk to each other. This meant that whatever happened at school, somehow mysteriously her mother knew it. And whatever happened at home, my gum, Miss Deach knew it. And it gave Temple consistency and expectation.
Yes.
It was entirely consistent, and it worked.
But the 2 systems were talking to each other.
Yes.
The family and education.
The family, we
were
were a
talking to
partnership.
each- Yes.
We were a partnership.
Yes.
And I so deeply honored them. It meant everything.
And I appreciate, Eustacia, that you use the word educators, because we're all educators.
That I could have what?
That you use the term educators.
Yes.
That's
Well, that
critical.
was Mr. Ladd's term. We're educators, is what he said.
That's critical.
And I think if we fast forward to the present day, you're still doing that work. You're carrying on that tradition, not necessarily with education. I mean, Temple has certainly exceeded all expectations as far as education is concerned, Dr. Temple Grandin and so on. But you are taking it to the next level. You're developing a relationship between what your experience has been and the autism community,
Yes.
your foundation.
Well, thank you for asking. Yes, the Temple Grandin Eustacia Cutler Autism Fund is dedicated to guiding and supporting all members of the family and the organizations helping them. Because you're doing a wonderful job right here
With Ladder.
helping families. Now what I also see, and that I'm trying to work on right now, is organizations don't know each other. I see them doing splendid work in different parts of the country. They kind of know of each other, but they don't know each other personally. And what I've started doing are a series of conference calls, limited just to 4 people on that call. That includes me, so there are 3 others, because that's a way in which we can talk to each other confidentially about things that nobody wants to talk about. And I feel we have to talk about them, otherwise we can't move the whole situation ahead. Let's not avoid them, but let's figure out by talking privately how to edit what we've said to make it palatable for other people, make it a subject that they can bear to think about. Because many times they can't bear to think about what's happening. And they need guidance. And this, I think we can do organization to organization, taking leaders like you and putting you together in a conversation with somebody from another part of the country. And conference calls are easy to do.
Oh, they are.
They're easier than Skype because you don't have to be in an expected place.
But sometimes this is the opportunity whereby maybe they didn't share before, but now they're sharing now because they're in a very comfortable zone.
Yes. That's what I'm trying to create, is a comfortable zone where we can talk about what particular family distresses are happening and how do we help. One of the things I've run into is domestic abuse.
Yes.
That's a very touchy subject.
Very sensitive.
And very sensitive, and I only learned about it when mothers came up to me privately. I found when I talk in different places, generally they're in hotels, the conferences, and so I linger and look at the pictures on the hotel wall. And somebody sees that I'm alone, they'll come up to me. And that's when they tell me privately something like domestic abuse. That's how I learned about it. I thought, okay, if that tendency is there in the family, it will be exacerbated by autism.
Yes.
And sometimes including the autistic child. You know, we have situations, horrible, horrible situations that come to light almost every week. There's another horrendous situation of children under siege on the spectrum. That once that pattern of domestic abuse starts to occur, it's passed down, it's delivered upon the child.
I know it is, and then the child copies it. It's like, again, the Bible. The sins of the father are visited upon the son, even unto the 3rd and 4th generation.
Yes.
It's true. And I hadn't, you see, there you're introducing me to an aspect I hadn't thought of, the fact that the child is going to copy this.
Yes.
Yes, it's going to model the behavior.
This is imitation.
It's imitation.
Yet the parents of behavior, the socialization that they learn from their parents is the model that they will follow.
That's it.
Without the ability to filter right from wrong in some ways, that if there is a function of that behavior to get what they want or whatever they need or to avoid, that is their behavior.
Or to return things to the status quo. And of course they're never going to return to the status quo.
Sure.
That's part of the problem. It's a whole new world. And I don't know whether all autism organizations ought to have a domestic hotline. I don't know always how to get at, how to relieve the situation. What's your take on it?
Well, I wish there were easy answers. I mean, we have plenty of questions. Do we have answers?
I have the questions. I don't have the answers.
Exactly.
But what's a good way to approach it, at least to acknowledge that it exists?
Well, I'd be interested to hear, we only have a couple minutes left. I wish we had more time, but I think that part of that answer lies in the appreciation of diverse neurology.
Yes.
that we have an opportunity to embrace and take a look at what are the strengths of our children on the spectrum. How do they grow up to be adults and positive contributors to society?
Well,
Maybe you
this
could
is,
speak to that.
it couldn't be more valuable that we must take note of the diversity of us, and that's valuable. And lots of times we have children that are a little quirky. Just give them a little boost. That's all they're going to need.
Yep.
And if we pay attention, we can. I think of Temple. Every step along the way, from the time she was 2 till she got into graduate school, people helped her.
Yes.
And helped me to understand. Like, for example, going to college. Temple wanted to go to college. The question was, could she? Could she manage the exams for college? Now, she went to the Hampshire School, which was a high school for teenagers with autism. Franklin Pierce College was right nearby. The two men sat down and talked together about how they would get Temple into Franklin Pierce.
That's wonderful.
And they did. And she graduated with honors, 4th in a class of 400.
Quite a legacy.
Eustacia, I know here on campus, and I know you do it with Green Tree and in your practice, but it's always looking at the strengths of the child. Why we have to stop focusing always on the needs.
No,
it's the strengths.
And I think
thank
that's
you.
a
That's
wonderful.
a valuable point. Let's go for what's strong.
Absolutely. So I think that I wish we had more time. Let's leave it at that wonderful place. We are at a place of strength within the autism community, hopefully sharing that with everyone out there today. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you next time.